Φίλες και φίλοι του ΚΕΦίΜ, καλησπέρα. Είμαι ο Αλέξανδρος Κούρας, είμαι ο πρόεδρος του ΚΕΦίΜ και σήμερα έχουμε τη μεγάλη χαρά να σας παρουσιάζουμε ένα ακόμα Masterclass. Θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά, καθότι ο καλεσμένος μας δεν είναι γνώστης της νέας ελληνικής. But Tom Palmer, Dr. Tom Palmer, he might not know modern Greek, but he speaks very well ancient Greek. And this is, today we thought that it would be a perfect opportunity to have Tom present to an audience that we know is starving for any connection of the ideas of freedom with Greek history. Because I know that this is a topic that is very near to and very dear to Tom's heart. Before I give the floor to Tom, I would like to tell you a few words about our speaker. Dr. Tom G. Palmer is the George M. Yeager Chair for Advancing Liberty and the Executive Vice President for International Programs at the Atlas Network. He's also a member of KEFiM's Advisory Board. At the Atlas Network, Tom is responsible for establishing and operating programs in 14 languages and maintaining programs for a worldwide network of think tanks. He's also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and the director of Cato University. And before he joined Cato, Tom was the H.B. Earhart Fellow at Hartford College, Oxford University, and a vice president of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. Tom has been a friend of the liberty movement in Greece since the beginning. I would say that without his mentorship and support, KEFiM would not exist in the way it exists today, and that is something that we'll always be grateful for. But he's also one of the most powerful and inspiring speakers and thinkers of the global liberty movement. So today, I believe that we are privileged to be hosting you, Tom. And my dear friend, mentor, and prime example and source of inspiration, you have the floor and tell us about liberty's roots in ancient Greece. And please unmute yourself, Tom.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Alexander, and thanks to all of my friends in Greece. I had hoped to be with you, being able to walk on the stones on which Aristotle and Pericles and others walked, but unfortunately we know why that hasn't happened. But thanks to other things we can derive from Greek civilization, nous, techne, and agora, we're able to meet online. So it's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm a great admirer of KEFiM. I think KEFiM is one of the most successful groups around the planet at reviving rationality in public discourse in their countries, and I tremendously admire KEFiM. I remember the Emergency Economic Summit for Greece that KEFiM organized, and I was privileged to be a part of that in 2015. And I think that was a real inflection point of turning Greece towards reasoned discourse and toward trying to find a better solution to the benefit of all of the people of Greece. Well, let me turn then to my discussion here, and I will start up my PowerPoint slide deck. I hope everyone can see that now. Let me start with a simple point that is important to remember, and that is that all of the archaic social orders distinguish in some way between the enslaved, who are not just generally one group of people. In fact, if you look at the linear B text from Mycenae, it's not easy to distinguish the slave, the servant, and the dependent. But there's a distinction between some people and others, and then those who are not enslaved. Those people generally didn't wish to be enslaved. They understood the distinction in their status. But on the other hand, they didn't generally fear it very much because the conditions of ancient warfare in the archaic period meant that if you lost a battle, you were slain. Generally, men certainly were not enslaved, they died in battle. And so the idea of going from the status of not being enslaved to being enslaved doesn't seem to occur to those elites and the people who exercise power and authority. It was not a social value or a political value as such. It was an everyday observation that there are different categories of people enjoying different statuses. Now, Greek and archaic religion generally was based on what we might call ancestor worship. Ancestor worship is not unique to Asian societies, where you often see it still practiced. There are family altars in China and Thailand and elsewhere. But it was definitely a characteristic of the Mediterranean and the Aegean worlds. The great French scholar, Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges, in his remarkable book, still quite readable, La Cité Antique, or the Ancient City, pointed out that every family had its own family religion, and that this was an important part of the life of a family. We still hear this even in the English language with the idea of hearth and home. The hearth, the burning of the home fire, was very important because it represented the persistence of the spirits or souls of the ancestors. In Athens and in other Greek polities, the leading families were the well-born, eupatridae. And those are the people who exercised effective authority or power within those political and social orders. It's quite interesting that in the writings of Homer, we find only 4 uses of the term for freedom. And 3 of them apply to women. And some scholars, such as Orlando Patterson, have made a great deal of this. So here we see the discussion between Hector and his wife Andromache. It is not so much the pain to come of the Trojans that troubles me as troubles me the thought of you when some bronze-armored Achaean leads you off, taking away your day of liberty. But may I be dead and the piled earth hide me under, before I hear you crying and know by this that they drag you captive. Now there's only one expression of liberty referring to men, and it is when the men talk about celebrating the bowl of liberty if they are to be triumphant. But the other 3 concern women. And I think this does reflect the fact that men understood that if they lost the war, they were going to be killed. But of course, the women would not experience it. They would be raped, they would be enslaved, they would be carried off to servitude as a consequence of a loss in battle.
Tom, if I may, a very short interruption. I want to mention to everybody that if they have questions, they can write them at the Q&A section, which is at the bottom panel that you will find on Zoom. You can post your questions there, and we will be able to discuss them. I will read them as many as time permits at the end of Tom's lecture, and there's going to be about 20 to 30 minutes of discussion on these.
Very good. I should point out that I am not primarily a classicist, and I am well aware that there are people participating in this seminar who are more knowledgeable about me than I am about the Greek text, such as Professor Aristides Hatzis, who I understand is among the participants, and others as well. We're going to shift forward to think about Athens. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that the dominant source of texts governing the ancient world are texts that originate or are associated with Athens, particularly dealing with the classical period. So that the texts that are available to us are very much dominated by texts by Athenians generated from Athens. Athens had reached a rather high level of wealth and personal freedom through commerce. The soil of Attica is not particularly rich for agriculture, and as a consequence, they took to the sea and engaged in trade and interacted with a multitude of peoples from all around the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean. There was an early attempt in Athens to overthrow the power of the well-born, and this is a quite interesting experience within Athenian history. About either 636 or 632 before the Common Era, an Athenian named Kylon or Kulon attempted to make himself the tyrant of Athens, the ruler in his own name. And he had support from the tyrant of Megara nearby. He failed, and his followers were all executed. There was an attempted coup, if you will, and that was put down by the other elites within the Athenian system. This is from a gravesite that was discovered fairly recently, and many scholars and archaeologists believe that it is likely that these were the coup leaders of Kulon's coup attempt who were executed. Many of these skeletons were found, they were bound in some fashion, so they were not just people who died from disease or from war, but they had been executed. Now in 621, Draco was called upon to codify the laws, and the laws had been exclusively customary and oral. And that's quite significant because it meant that those priestly families, the well-born, were in the special position of being able to interpret the laws. Laws were oral and customary, so they were the ones who were the keepers of the laws. And unsurprisingly, knowing what we do about human nature, they tended to interpret them in ways that would be favorable to them. Draco codified the law, and that opened it to beyond the established families and their family religions and the priestly functions of the heads of those families. Aristotle, in his remarkable and very important book, The Constitution of Athens, if I may make a slight digression, Athens and Aristotle and his school, his students, had written down the constitutions of the various Greek cities. Only one survived, and that was rediscovered in the back of a discarded papyrus, and it happens to be that of Athens. So the most interesting generally. It's a terrible loss that all of the others were lost over time. But he referred to the constitution that was formed under Draco when the first code of laws was drawn up. And these were then displayed in the agora on moving, I don't know what the right word is in English, but written down, and then you could move them around so people could come and read what the laws were. He also established a council, which was alongside their Areopagus. We might consider that the Senate, similar to the Roman Republic, of 400 citizens that were elected by the citizenry of Athens. Now, nonetheless, there was civil strife that continued, that festered. Aristotle in the Constitution of Athens talked about the many being enslaved to the few, and the people rose against the notables. There was a general trend throughout the Aegean, not only among the Athenians, of debt slavery, and scholars differ as to why this happened at this time. In 594, Solon was elected the Archon. He repealed many of Draco's laws, most of which are lost to us. We don't know exactly what they said. And he declared a general amnesty from debt slavery. He freed those who had been enslaved for their debts, and he even rescued and ransomed people who had been enslaved for failure to pay debts and then sold abroad. And he returned them home, having paid a ransom or bought them back, if you will. And after that point, it was forbidden to use your own person as surety for debt, as a kind of a collateral, if you will. And that was a very important point because it established an inalienable right among Athenian citizens not to be enslaved. So for crimes, they could be executed, they could be punished, they could be exiled, but they could not lose their status of as free citizens through enslavement. And he also annulled the obligations of the tenant farmers who had been falling into debt and secured their right to property. So it was a great property reform movement, and also a movement that secured property, helped to define what property rights were, and secured them from being taken by people who are more powerful as a consequence. Freeing them from debt bondage was extraordinarily important. And Kurt Raaflaub, the great German, now teaching in the United States, classicist, pointed out that the abolition of debt bondage established individual freedom as the citizen's inalienable right. Now, the issue, as a consequence, lost its political salience. It disappeared from the political agenda because it didn't find expression as a lasting political concept. People said, okay, we're free now, and it didn't rise again to the level for some time of being a topic of public discourse. A bit like, as they say, fish don't talk very much about water, it's just all around them. It's only when you're losing something that you're more likely to bring it to the fore and make it a topic of conversation. Nonetheless, the civil strife persisted even after Solon's wise reforms, and 31 years after Pisistratus seized power, established again a tyranny, he exploited various conflicts between the men of the city and of the environs, the mountains and of the coast. He disarmed the public and created a personal bodyguard, just loyal to him, that would travel with him and protect him. And he put all of his supporters, his cronies, if you will, into the key offices of the polis. Now, he died while still exercising power, and was succeeded by his son Hippias, who was quite cruel. Apparently, his brother Hipparchus was even worse. And the latter had made very unwelcome overtures to a free-born young Athenian citizen, Harmodius. That did not go well for Hipparchus. And later, the cult of Harmodius and Aristogiton that was established was a cult to the freedom of the citizens. They organized a group of free citizens to revolt. Both of them died in the process, but they were remembered as having fought for the freedom of Athens and against the tyranny that had been established within it by Pisistratus and then his sons. In 510, with the help of the Spartans, they expelled Hippias from the city. Isagoras, the Athenian, allied with them and expelled Cleisthenes, who then called upon the people to rebel and expel the Spartans again. This is, by the way, I have an image. We don't know exactly what Cleisthenes looked like. This actually is a modern bust that is currently in the State House of the state of Ohio, of Cleisthenes, who was a very important figure in the development of the institutions of freedom. And he left a very, very long impact around the world. He was elected archon in 507 and began what we could call the democratic reformation of Athens. He instituted a kind of a federal system. He established a council of 500 and then divided up the Athenian polity in such a way that there was an early kind of checks and balances system. There were 10 tribes constituted by 30 ridings, 139 villages, towns, and neighborhoods that were known as demoi, or as we say in English, the demes, from which we get the idea of democratic and democracy. Each one of these was assigned to a tribe, and it was done in such a way that 1/3 came from the plains of Athens and its environs, 1/3 from the mountains, and 1/3 from the coasts. And this meant that the various groups that formed the entire polity of Attica had to interact with each other, so that it divided up power. You didn't have now just the people of the mountain against the people of the city or the coast, but rather each one of the demes drew from all three of those. This is extraordinarily important. I have an image there from a very good book that came out 2015 by Josiah Ober, who's a very high-level political scientist. He is a empirical political scientist, but also a talented and remarkable classicist, looking at the complexity of the Athenian system, a kind of federalism. One of the other great innovations was isegoria. It doesn't mean quite what we would call today freedom of speech, but it was equal access to speech, equal speech, that all would be able to speak before the assembly, and that people could not be punished for speaking in the assembly, even if they were later to lose a vote. This was very important because it drew forth rational discourse among the entire population of free persons in Athens. People were not afraid to utter their views, and that's important to come to a reasoned a discourse and a reasonable view for the public. Now, we could compare that with what was done by James Madison, and I'd like to quote from the Federalist Papers. He said, "You cannot eliminate or remove the causes of faction. The relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects." And in Federalist number 10, Madison gave a very Kleisthenic approach to this. He said, the way you do that, either the existence of the same passion or interest in the majority at the same time must be prevented. That's not really possible. Or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local simulation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. So this idea then of checks and balances, and of also making it difficult for any one faction to gain the total control of the state, was really pioneered by Kleisthenes, who's one of the great figures in political theory and in political practice. So there were key Greek concepts that prepared the way for liberty. And I will talk later about the way in which modern concepts of liberty are rooted in these concepts that emerged first in Greek civilization. Isonomia, equal laws or equality before the law, or the rule of law, different ways of articulating this, but the idea that there's not one law for you and another one for me, that we have equal laws to govern us. Isegoria, equal speech, that there's not one person or one group of citizens who can speak and all the rest must be silent, but all would enjoy equality of speech. And that is a necessity for reasonable discourse. That is to say, to coming to a closer or better appreciation of the truth through discourse, through rational conversation. And then isokratia, equal power. One man, and it did mean one man, only males, one vote. So then these ideas, all rooted in the concept of equality, equality of the citizens. Now, I've noted very importantly that we see most of these articulated in texts from Athens. It could be, and some have speculated, that the Athenians drew their inspiration for liberty also from other parts of the Mediterranean and the Aegean, because they were in constant contact with others, and in particular from the Greek cities of Ionia, who were subject to the Persian tyranny. Now, those are all democratic values. We identify them as democracy, equality before the law, equal speech, and the idea of equal power. But in what way are they equivalent to liberty? And here something really remarkable happens that distinguishes the Greek civilization and brings out the idea of freedom as a dominant social or political concept that becomes the key to understanding that civilization. And that is that they confronted an invader that knew nothing of popular government. And those, of course, are the Persians. There are two invasions. Greeks are well acquainted with their history, so I won't go into the details. Under Darius, and of course the famous Battle of Marathon that had been celebrated ever since. And then the second invasion under Xerxes, who attempted to bring about revenge, to punish the Greeks of the mainland and the islands for having resisted the great king of Persia. And again, the remarkable defeats by the Greeks, who were outnumbered tremendously against the greatest army in the world at the time. The battles of Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale, which are well known certainly to Greeks today, but also to anyone who knows about the roots of freedom and also about the roots of European civilization generally. Now, a very important part of this was the role of bearing arms, and that played a very strong role in the transformation and popularization of political power. Themistocles, very importantly, had said that Athens needed to become a great naval power, and he constantly spoke out, we must raise the money and we must use it to build a powerful navy. That is the way that we can defend ourselves. That meant that the Thetes, really in a sense the lowest class of citizens, the menials, had an important role because they became the rowers in the Athenian navy. And the entire system, not only the well-born or the aristocrats or the wealthy, had to rely on the menials, the day laborers, who were the ones who would row the ships. And those people came to have a great importance. Now, there was one in particular, one Athenian who fought at the Battle of Marathon and possibly also at Salamis, one of the greatest artists in human history, the great tragedian Aeschylus. And in his play, The Persians, which is a remarkable play, it's written some years later, and it's written largely from the perspective of the Persians. I want to meditate for a moment about this, because instead of seeing the Persians as mortal enemies and as evil or wicked or terrible or bad people or subhuman, he saw them as humans. And he saw the suffering of the Persian women at the loss of husbands, of sons, of fathers, of brothers, of uncles, and he was very sympathetic to them. So this is a particularly important play because it shows a higher level of appreciation, what it meant to be a human being. That it's not just we, the Greeks, against the barbaroi, the people who cannot speak Greek, the barbarians, as we say in English today, but saw the Persians as people. Well, the Persian queen asks of the Greeks, regarding the Greeks, she asks of the chorus, who commands them? Who is shepherd of their host? And the chorus of the Persian elders responds, they are slaves to none, nor are they subject. This is an articulation of the idea of the Greeks as being free. One of the characteristics of Greek civilization was freedom. And it's raised to a preeminent characteristic of their culture and civilization, a social or a political value as such. Now, remember I talked earlier about archaic orders and systems in the ancient and classical world. Almost all of them had some system of slavery, a differentiation between masters and slaves. But it was the Greeks who raised the idea of freedom not merely to a personal status that you might enjoy, but to something that characterized their civilization and their culture. It's remarkable, of course, that slavery persisted. So it's not that they saw it as a universal human right, but they saw the enjoyment of freedom as a civilizational value, not merely something I happen to have accidentally enjoyed, but something that people would want and strive for. Now, as the preeminent naval power, Athens rose as a significant force throughout the Hellenic world and beyond. The Delian League that was established to fight against the Persians and to maintain the independence of the Greeks and their freedom meant that Athens was able, in effect, to extract tribute. They moved the treasury from Delos to Athens, and some of the greatest architecture in the world was built as a consequence of that. It was an abuse of power and widely seen as such. The Athenians were now in a position to forcibly extract tribute from their ostensible allies. And that led to the charge that, well, the Athenians were enslaving other Greeks. And this meant that now freedom wasn't something that merely distinguished Greeks from non-Greeks, but was something among the Greeks themselves, that some of them were having it and some were losing it, and that it was a topic about which people fought. Thucydides pointed out in his very important history, which is a really remarkable and amazing book, that it was the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm that that inspired in Lacedaemon or among the Spartans that made war inevitable, that the Spartans saw that they had to challenge the Athenians or they would fall into insignificance. As a consequence of this conflict among the Greeks, freedom came to be seen not just as a distinguishing feature of the Hellenes, who might be superior in some sense from the Barbaroi, the non-Greeks, but it was something that varied among the Greeks. And very importantly, it became a propaganda tool. Freedom was a topic of contention among the Greek leagues, the Delian League, the Peloponnesian League, deployed by Athenians and Spartans against each other. So this is another way in which it was raised to a very high level, something that people were fighting over. What does freedom mean? Now, the war between Sparta and Athens focused attention on the Athenian concept of freedom, which included living as one pleases. And in his great funeral oration, Pericles declaimed on what it meant to enjoy freedom. And I'll read it a little bit of length because it's such powerful language. Our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are a pattern to others rather than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few, which is why it is called a democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If no social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity. Class considerations not being allowed to interfere with merit, nor again does poverty bar the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. The freedom which we Athenians, enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. But all this ease in our private relations did not make us lawless as citizens. And this is a very important point. One had the freedom to live as one pleased, but it did not mean that you were lawless, or as we would say in English, living by license. You lived liberty under equal laws. Against this fear of being lawless is against this fear is our chief safeguard, teaching us to obey the magistrates and the laws, particularly such as regard the protection of the injured, where they are actually in the statute book or belong to that code which, although unwritten, yet cannot be broken without acknowledged disgrace. So freedom and law were compatible. It was the condition of being free citizens, not lawless or subject to license. Now, this great political system, the polity, does come to an end. The rise of Macedon, which was intended to unify the Greeks in order to invade Persia and defeat the Persians once and for all. This was the argument Philip and later Alexander gave for this, but it meant ultimately the defeat of the Greek polity, of the polis, in the Battle of Chaeronea, in which the Macedonians defeated the armies of Athens and of Thebes, brought that independent polis under royal power. And then, of course, Alexander's invasion of Persia and the rise of the Hellenic civilization, which was much more characterized by royal despotism than by the great political systems of the classical period. It's worth, however, remembering Demosthenes, who did lead the Athenians into a catastrophic war with Macedon, which they lost, and the effective loss of their independence. Nonetheless, after that defeat, praised the fight for liberty. No, you were not wrong, men of Athens, you were not wrong when you accepted the risks of war for the redemption and the liberties of mankind. This is quite remarkable also, the liberties of mankind. I swear it by our forefathers who bore the brunt of battle at Marathon, who stood in the phalanx line at Plataea, who strove in the sea fights of Salamis and Artemisia, all the brave men who lie in our public cemeteries. So here in this speech, liberty is raised up as something important for all of mankind. And the Athenians were vindicating that liberty. Now, the Greeks and the Romans are very important contributors to European and world civilization. We got philosophy, persuasion, all kinds of institutions from the Greeks, the ideas of democracy, of equality, of liberty. The Romans gave us the laws that institutionalized the ideas of liberty. And that's an important element. And the Roman law that persisted was a carrying forth of some of this tradition of the Greeks. The Greeks pioneered liberty, and the Romans furthered its law. We think about similar things that happened in Rome: the overthrow of the monarchy, the reduction of hereditary privilege, the elimination of debt slavery, and then the Roman Constitution, a very complex body of powers, privileges, immunities, and rights that limited power and made it difficult for anyone to attain personal supremacy over the state. So this is a kind of additional layer of the heritage of freedom added by the Romans. And indeed, a great deal of the thought of the classical world was transmitted to the modern world by the works of Marcus Tullius Cicero, which were very widely copied. And one of his statements in his book on duties: we are all constrained by one and the same law of nature. And if that is true, then we are certainly forbidden by the law of nature from acting violently against another person. And the consequence of this was to raise as a human right this idea of not being violated, not being subject to injustice and violence, and to be equal before the law. Now, classical Greek liberty inspired the moderns, and there's a very important work, Benjamin Constant, on the liberty of the ancients compared with that of the moderns. I highly recommend this brilliant essay. And he did focus on Athens as the one that resembled the modern liberty that was experienced. He identified it with their focus on trade and the independence and freedom that it brought to the citizens, and their love of individual or personal independence. But we're inspired not only by the Greeks of the classical period, but by those of modernity. Adamantios Korais, for example, is a remarkable figure in the development of the ideas of freedom for the modern world. And modern Greece was born in a struggle for freedom that was understood as such by the Greek people. And I'll close with his powerful words from the hymn of liberty, the anthem of that struggle. We knew thee of old, O divinely restored, by the lights of thine eyes and the light of thy sword. From the graves of our slain shall thy valor prevail. As we greet thee again, hail, liberty, hail. This is a great gift to humanity that comes from Greek civilization. And I, for one, am grateful.
Well, thank you, Tom, for this wonderful presentation. I will remind to everyone that they can post their questions on the Q&A. It doesn't matter if it's in Greek or in English. I will translate the questions as you ask them. We already have a few, but I would like to ask everybody who would like to ask Tom anything to just post a question on the Q&A, as we still have a little more time. And I will start by reading a couple of them that we've already gotten. The first one is, what books would you recommend to read on liberty in ancient Greece?
Well, this is a really remarkable opportunity to increase our knowledge, because the knowledge of the classical world is much greater now than it was 40, 50, 100, 200 years ago. Thanks to the growth of archaeology, for example, the epigraphy, we do know more now than we knew in the past. And there are a couple of books that I would recommend very strongly. I can find them here. Two in particular that I benefited from. I mentioned Kurt Raaflaub, The Discovery of Freedom in Ancient Greece, published by University of Chicago Press. He rewrote this in English. He wrote an earlier version in German, but he has rewritten it and updated it. It's an astonishingly powerful book, and I really enjoyed it. I should point out it's quite challenging, perhaps less for Greeks because they know more of the Greek text, but it's a difficult book and a bit of a slow read, but really remarkable. And he makes the argument that it was in Greek civilization that these ideas of freedom first achieved a social or political value of all of the civilizations in the world. Another that I really enjoyed is by Professor Josiah Ober of Stanford University. Ober is, again, a great classicist. He's also an empirical quantitative political scientist, and he mines the archaeological record, the existence of part shards and trade routes and so many other things very effectively. And this book is The Rise and Fall of Classical Greece. It's also quite recent. Let's see, it came out 2015 from Princeton University Press. And he looks not only at Athens or the textual sources, but at the entire ecology rather, of the Greek world, in the interaction among the multitude of polities in Greece, the role of innovation, of competition, and of rational cooperation. And he says this provided the kind of a perfect, I don't know, petri dish, if you will, within which the ideas of freedom, of market economy, of exchange, and of democratic self-governance were able to arise. Now, there's another book that's quite fun. It's a much easier book. I read this really for pleasure, and that is Anthony Everett's book, The Rise of Athens, the story of the world's greatest civilization. Everett is a classicist who writes a remarkably good and clear and beautiful English. It's quite accessible. This came out 2017 from Random House. So depending on your level of interest, if you'd like a general overview, I think Everett's book focusing on Athens is delightful. Josiah Ober's for understanding the Greek civilization as such and what distinguished it from others. And then Kurt Raaflaub's, if you're interested in a very careful examination of every use of freedom, of autonomia, of autarkia, of isegoria, isonomia, and isokratia, and related concepts within the Greek discourse, then Raaflaub is the book that I would read. I hope that's helpful.
That's great, and I'm going to make sure, we are going to make sure that our communications team is going to add links to these books in the description of this webinar once we publish it on YouTube and Facebook and elsewhere. Another question has to do with the value of liberty in ancient Greece in relation to women. Was the situation for women, were the women freer than in other places in ancient Greece, or this value extend only to men?
I think that's actually a very deep and important question. The value of freedom as participating in the public discussion was exclusively for men. They bore arms, and that was a very important part of the citizenship. Women, nonetheless, had a much higher status than they did in other civilizations of the time. So that there are very important women who we think about in Athens, who had held what were later called salons, conversation groups or dinner parties where people would come together, and great thinkers and philosophers and tragedians and others gathered at the homes of important women for these elevated conversations. I think it's fair to say that based on the available evidence that women had a much greater status, a higher status, certainly free-born women. They were not citizens in the sense of participating in the public discourse. But we do know also from the various comedies and from the tragedies of the period that women exercised a very powerful role in the public discourse. They were able to motivate their husbands to stand up for these ideas. I think of Dolly Madison in the American context saying to her husband, when women political rights in the foundation of the early American Republic and the struggle for liberty, she said to her husband, please have a thought for the ladies, that women were important also. The Greeks generally treated women as in a much better fashion than other civilizations at the time. I happen to consider that a mark of the degree of civilization generally. There were also, of course, great Greek poets who were women, and the teacher of Socrates' Diotima was a woman as well. So I think that the status of women was higher, but very importantly, they did not have the power of participating formally in public debates or lawsuits.
And there's going to be a follow-up. One of our attendees asks, how significantly did the concepts of liberty in ancient Greece influence the shaping of the US Constitution and democratic system?
Quite substantially, and we would say Greeks and Romans. There's also a very strong Roman element in the foundation of the American constitutional system as well. The Senate, Senatus, which is drawn from the Roman Republic, and there are many other examples of that, but definitely the Greeks as well. The author of the first draft of the Constitution of the United States was James Madison. And in preparation for that, he acquired a huge number of, really quite a remarkable library of books from the classical world that looked at different federations and confederations to understand why some persisted and some did not, why some led to a greater enjoyment of liberty among the citizens and others did not. And of course, that meant a great deal of reading from the Greek world. So those texts were extremely important in the formation of the American political system. Obviously, there's not just a direct line of descent. There's a lot of water under the bridge and things that happen between the classical world and the modern world. But those texts are quite important. I should point out generally that they were significant for the revival of European civilization when the Renaissance, the rebirth, and humanism in Europe was very much based, we're talking earlier, obviously, than the American founding, on the reading of Greek texts that were now made available once again, and the Greek language becomes a very important part of the education of people throughout Europe, and they have access to texts that had been lost in the West for a long time because they were maintained only in the libraries of the Eastern Roman Empire. And then when that finally succumbed to the Ottoman conquest, many people fled to Italy and elsewhere, and they took with them these classical Greek texts.
Another question, now the questions are starting to flow in. So this is I thank everyone for their participation. Our Director of Research, Aristides Hadjis, asks, can you please discuss briefly Benjamin Constant's thesis on the liberty of the ancients, especially his critique of the Athenian democracy?
Well, put in the context, so in 1819, Constant gave a lecture which was remarkably influential, and it's worth reading. It's a great work of political theory. I should point out it's effectively an election speech, encouraging people to go out and vote for the liberal candidates in the elections. He addresses the question of what had happened during the French revolutions. I always prefer the plural to that. There wasn't just one revolution. There's a whole series of events and political moves within France that people lump together as one thing. And I think that's too simplistic. But it doesn't turn out well. It starts with a plea for liberty. It's very strongly about freedom. And then you end up with the terror and finally Napoleon and despotism again. And he asked the question, well, what happened? That's the background to it. And he argues that the wrong idea of liberty was articulated. And here he's thinking really about the ideas of Plato. So Plato was a truly great philosopher, a genius. In many ways, I think his contribution to political thought was negative. There's debate over what Plato really thought because he wrote in the dialogue form, which is intended to get us to think about these things. But certainly the legacy of the texts in the Republic were to promote highly illiberal systems, including communism and the abolition of property, at least for the guardian class. And so at the time of the French revolutions, figures such as Robespierre were talking about the liberty of the ancients but they were thinking primarily of the Spartans, and they were thinking of their, how shall I put it, apologists. And I think Plato, frankly, among them. Plato is not a very good guide to how life was lived in Athens. He was highly alienated from the actual Athenian civilization and culture, and promoted an ideology that was contrary to the commercial civilization that made possible the enjoyment of liberty. So Constant said it was this bad idea of freedom. And he said, that's the freedom of the ancients, to govern yourselves as a collectivity, but within it, for each individual to have no freedom whatsoever. He said, modern freedom is based on commerce, and commerce means the freedom of movement, freedom of transactions, and we cannot enjoy that ancient liberty again. He then distinguished, he says, however, people will be surprised that I talk this way when we think about Athens. And he distinguished the Athenians as having something closer to that idea of modern liberty, and I quoted very briefly from it. It's worth reading and thinking about. He did nonetheless criticize, I think, too strongly the Athenian system, because he was very shocked by the experience of, now the word escapes me in English, when you kick someone out of the society.
Ostracism.
Ostracism, thank you very much. That they would have the votes, and you would take the little piece of broken pottery shard, which is where we get the word ostracism, and write someone's name, and that person could then be expelled. It, in fact, was not very frequently used, but he thought it was a really defining characteristic. I don't think it was. And others, such as Rafflaub and Ober, think that his criticism of Athens was a little bit too strong. I hope that that wraps it up. I encourage people to go back and read that text for themselves. It's remarkable work.
Yep. Another question is, this is very interesting. Are there any competing views on how other Greeks viewed freedom? And I know, on KEFiM's board, we have the mayor of Sparta, who is very adamant about, Sparta's constitution and Sparta's political system have been underplayed because there's a constant promotion of their warrior culture and all that. But he claims that Sparta had to say things about freedom too. What's your take on that?
I think actually that's quite reasonable in the following sense, that the Spartans raised the abuse by the Athenians of the other Greek cities. And we have to be just very frank, this is just stealing. They took the money from Delos and built fabulous, amazing works of art, but it was really theft. And then the extraordinary high-handedness that Thucydides documents so brilliantly, and he, of course, understood that internally. He saw that as arrogance and hubris. And I think that the Spartan response to that was furthered the conversation. Sparta has had a reputation as having been not in favor of freedom, we could put it that way, partly because of their treatment of the Helots. So the conquest of the other neighboring populations and reduction to the most terrible kind of slavery known as helotry, that was even worse than the slavery experienced by other people, has left them with a legacy that, let's just say, is not generally positive for the experience of freedom. That said, they did stand up for the independence, possibly as an opportunistic propaganda move, of the other Greek cities that were suffering under the yoke of Athenian tribute. So I think that there's something to be said for this, and I don't want to leave people with the impressions that the Athenians, in every regard at all times, acted as champions of justice and virtue and freedom. This is simply not the case.
All right, I'm going to try to put a multi-question in place because we're running out of time, and I know that you have a very important webinar coming up with the Nobel laureate Vernon Smith in about an hour or so. So we're going to make this quick. So there's multiple questions here. I'll try to group them. One of them, we see questions about why do we notice in ancient history, and maybe in modern too, democratic countries that seem to place a value on freedom to eventually subside and lose to authoritarian and command societies like the empires that rose afterwards, and Alexander, or the Roman Empire, which consumed the Republic and all that. There's another group of questions that has to do with, the main theme is, what was so special about classical Greece? Why did freedom arise there? What were the ideas or institutions or factors that attributed to these huge wins for freedom in that part of the world at that particular time? And finally, what do you think is the effect of the Greek Stoic philosophical system in the tradition of liberty? And
wow.
This will be the last question.
Okay, so many amazing questions. I could spend my life trying to understand the questions and probably not answer them adequately. I think one element is it compatible with modern life? And I think the answer is yes. And indeed, Montesquieu had argued that liberty could only be enjoyed in small republics. And it was Madison's response to that to argue that the federal system, which the Athenians pioneered within Attica, by the way, and then among the federations of the Greek cities, the federal system made possible the enjoyment of liberty within much larger political systems. And I think we have experienced it, and this was drawn from lessons from the Greek world, that Montesquieu was wrong about that question. I think Madison was correct. The passage of this system, that it died, well, everything dies. Nothing is forever, and we should remember that. There are always occasions in which systems have bad luck, and one of them was Philip of Macedon, who destroyed effectively the polis of the classical period of Greece. But nonetheless, the ideas that were written down, and here we can thank the high degree of literacy of Athenian culture, but Greek culture generally, a very high degree of literacy, which I think is attributable largely to a merchant culture. Merchants need to be able to write letters. They need to be able to calculate. And being involved in a trading culture meant a widespread literacy. That meant people wrote things, and it meant that those ideas persisted into the modern world. That said, how much was lost? We have a tiny fraction of the books, the documents, the dialogues, the letters of that period, but it's enough to give us a peek into how they lived, and it was enough to transmit to us a truly glorious heritage that came from the ancient world to us. I am very deeply grateful for it, and I continue to be inspired by those ideas, by those figures, and I don't want to sound chauvinist and put Greeks above others. They were the ones who stumbled across it first, but it is not a uniquely Greek heritage. It is now the heritage of humanity, not merely of one civilization, but of all of us. And for that, I want to conclude by thanking the modern day Greeks of KEFiM for keeping that tradition alive and continuing to inspire me as well. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you, Tom, for this wonderful presentation and for everything you're doing for the cause of freedom around the world. I'm going to turn for a maximum 1 minute into Greek to inform everybody where they can find out more about our programs, etc. But it was a real pleasure having you at this webinar, and we're grateful for this very inspiring presentation, and we're looking forward to our next meeting, my dear friend. Λοιπόν, θέλω να σας ευχαριστήσω όλες και όλους που ήσασταν εδώ σήμερα. Μπορείτε να επισκεφτείτε τη σελίδα του KEFiM, www.kefim.org, για να δείτε, να μάθετε περισσότερα για τα επόμενα προγράμματα της Φιλελεύθερης Ακαδημίας, μέρος του οποίου ήταν αυτό το Masterclass. Έχουμε μία σειρά διαλέξεων με θέμα 1821, η Φιλελεύθερη Επανάσταση, με τον καθηγητή Αριστίδη Χατζή. Εδώ μιλάμε για μια σειρά 6 2ωρων εξ αποστάσεως διαλέξεων για την Επανάσταση του 21, οι οποίες ξεκινάνε την Παρασκευή. Το κόστος συμμετοχής είναι 80 ευρώ και 40 ευρώ για νέους μέχρι 26 ετών και ανέργους. Οι θέσεις είναι ιδιαίτερα περιορισμένες. Αν σας ενδιαφέρει, σας συνιστώ να μπείτε γρήγορα και να κάνετε τις απαραίτητες κινήσεις στο site του KEFiM για να εγγραφείτε στο πρόγραμμα αυτό. Και εντός των επόμενων ημερών θα ανακοινώσουμε και τα επόμενα masterclasses και τα επόμενα ακαδημαϊκά μας προγράμματα που λόγω του COVID-19 είμαστε υποχρεωμένοι να μην τα κάνουμε στην υπέροχη στέγη Μάρκου Δραγούμη, αλλά να τις κάνουμε μέσω Zoom και άλλων διαδικτυακών μέσων. Thank you again, Tom. Ευχαριστούμε όλες και όλους σας για τη συμμετοχή σας και καλή συνέχεια.
Ευχαριστώ.